Alright, well, this is the beginning of my audio blog. I apologize in advance if this is not as formal or as organized as one might hope, but this is my first time doing an audio blog, so I guess we'll just see how it goes. So I was lucky enough to have a partner in all of this, Molly Rosner, and we both were kind of inspired and entranced by the idea of fire and light and their relationship and the contrast between them in organized religion, specifically Abrahamic religion. So we decided that we would go through a variety of experiences, try and broaden our horizons, and try and figure out more about the religious world that I personally am not too aware or familiar with, I guess I should say. So we kind of planned out our fieldwork studies in a variety of ways, ranging from interviews to visits of specific sites to all sorts of types of things. So it's been a really great experience, and I've been able to glean a lot from it. I'd like to think that I'm a better person because of this project. But I guess to start out, why fire? Why light? And I think there's a very interesting tension between those two elements in religion. I think on one hand we often associate fire with hellfire. It's a very dangerous, it's a very powerful, it's a very destructive thing. But in also some cases it can be very empowering and very warming. So I was very interested in seeing how that kind of played itself in organized religion. And then light, we go to a Quaker school, I go to a Quaker school, and we are often taught that there is that of God in everyone, and that takes the form in an inner light. So again, we see this contrast between light and fire that I was just extremely fascinated by. So I decided that, delving into this tension and finding out what this connection and its origins was something I wanted to do. So yeah, Molly was great. She allowed me to go to do a lot of different things. She opened a lot of doors I might not have been able to access otherwise, so I'm eternally grateful for you, Molly. I guess we should start with our very first fieldwork project. My grandfather always joked that my family was Jewish. I don't think he was joking. I think he legitimately believes that there is some Jewish blood in our family. So I was very interested, and I've always been very interested in the Jewish faith and Judaism. And, it was very interesting going and seeing a real synagogue, shul, and having a very intimate and real conversation with a rabbi. I never had this experience before, and I was very excited. And Molly was nice enough to allow me to accompany her to her shul and to meet her with her Rabbi Berg. And that was a very interesting experience. Rabbi Berg was an amazing man. He was very wise. He was very young guy, not at all what I had imagined, but he was very wise, very knowledgeable. And, we had lots of questions to ask him, and we only had 45 minutes, unfortunately, but he told us a lot in those 45 minutes. So we first started out asking him to give us, an overview of nature's role in Judaism. And excuse me if I consult my notes, I don't want to, mess anything up. And, he talked about how there's two different versions of Genesis, how, and they speak on nature differently. On one hand, man is dominant, superior, and man is responsible for shaping the world. This is kind of the more old, traditional, fundamentalist type view, I feel. And there's the more 21st century norm version of Genesis, where man is more of like a steward to nature. He must till it and tend it, to use Rabbi Berg's words, and it's like a garden, as seen in the second chapter of Genesis. Not in the pagan form, don't get me wrong, but we must leave and treat nature with a love of humanity and tenderness that, according to the Jewish faith, God intended us to. And that's why in the 21st century we see such a rise in things like eco-Judaism, which is a fairly new and interesting development. In fact, Rabbi Berg says that Deuteronomy states that man can't cut down enemy trees in war because trees do not have the ability to defend themselves. So even in the very beginning, we see an emphasis on the protection and loving nature of man towards nature, and how there's great emphasis on that. We continue that throughout time, which I think is very fascinating and very enlightening. And in fact, many holidays are tied to a variety of old agricultural festivals. Before we had all this technology that we have today, we all know that man was very dependent on nature to survive. And as a result, a lot of our holidays today are based off of agricultural holidays. So from nature with Rabbi Berg, we went to fire and flame. And the concept, I was not anticipating what Rabbi Berg was going to tell me, because I had always been used to, the more I guess in the terms of my family, the traditional view of the afterlife. You have heaven and you have hell. The concept of hell, Rabbi Berg told us, is much more radical in Christianity than in Judaism. Hell is not as drastic. Fire and light are symbols of goodness and God's presence. But this is not unique to Judaism, according to Rabbi Berg. Light is illumination, and that can be seen in a variety of religions. It's a sign of wisdom, warmth, and enlightenment. For instance, the burning bush that spoke to Moses. God reveals himself as fire. And this is why Moses was such a great leader. He was able to look into this, what seemingly was a natural occurrence and see the awe, the necessity to delve into what was happening. And he was able to glean a lot from that experience. For this bushfire instance, many Jews thought this was just a natural occurrence, but Moses saw more, as I just said. And that burning bush, that raw power, shows the power, the warmth, and uncontrollable nature of fire, which I think is kind of a drastic way of explaining God's role in religion. God has unmatchable, unparalleled power that can't be contained if God so chooses to release it. So I think there's a great similarity between the role of flame and the role of God. In fact, the Midrash, which is a commentary on the Torah, we see lots of commentaries on the Torah. That's a huge part of scripture in Judaism. Says that burning bushes in nature isn't strange, but Moses took the time to see that fire was not behaving normally, which, like I said, is why he was a great leader. He saw that the bush was not being consumed, but that the fire was still all-encompassing of it. God is beyond nature. And this is something that I think we see all over, especially in Abrahamic religions. God is above nature, but yet he sets great store on the emphasis of preserving and loving nature. And as many people know, in Judaism, candle lighting is a hugely important aspect of the faith. And, Rabbi Berg explained to me and Molly that, there's a variety of reasons for this. There's obviously the practical role, just used to gain light. You people didn't used to have electricity. They used to have light bulbs or whatever you use to light your house. So candles were obviously the easiest thing to use. It was used so you could function at night during your Shabbat, where you can't use electricity. So even now, in more traditionally oriented Jewish households, you use candlelight to function. And then we have the Hidar Mitzvah, which is very different. This is, the beautification commandment, as Rabbi Berg called it. And he used Hanukkah as an example, I think was very good. During Hanukkah, light of the menorah is only used for beautification purposes. You can't read by the light of the menorah. It is only used to beautify those around it, like people or whatever is happening around the menorah. So reading by the light of the menorah is prohibited. But Rabbi Berg kind of talked about Shabbat in a very interesting way that I never really thought about. I, like he said, like many other people believe, see Shabbat as a very constricting and restraining practice because we just think it's all these things that you can't do. But he told us that there's really only 39 prohibitions on the Sabbath, but that there really are things that you're supposed to do. It's not just prohibitions, but things you are supposed to do. But for instance, with these prohibitions, there's roots in these prohibitions. There's a great origins. There's great meaning behind why these prohibitions exist. For instance, they use fire to make the tabernacle. So you can't use fire on Shabbat. You can't use anything that was used on the day to create the tabernacle in the desert. For one cannot do what was done to make the tabernacle, or what was done on the day that the tabernacle was created. And this is why people light candles on Friday night and on Sunday before and after the Shabbat to bookend it. It's kind of setting the tone, ending the tone, and to constantly remind you of why you're doing things that you're doing. And then we have the eternal fire. I think this is also very consistent throughout Abrahamic religions. Fire is an eternal thing. It has been here, it will always be here, and that is a great symbol for what God is like on this earth. But then again, as previously stated, fire is dangerous. It's often used to destroy. And Rabbi Berg used the example of, God casting down flame and fire on the priests of Baal, who were sacrificing and worshiping to the wrong God. So here we see the wrath of God exercised by using the tool of fire. which I think we all kind of have seen before. But fire has developed a very negative image in Judaism because of its role in the history of the Jewish people. Many people who may not even be that well versed in the history of Judaism can, attest to the fact that they have been through a lot as a people. They have been subject to torture, to killing, to all sorts of hatred of the Babylonians, the Romans, the Nazis, the Holocaust. All these very different things, all these awful occurrences were kind of centered around the use of fire, which is awful. And so, fire for the Jewish people often causes a visceral reaction, to use Rabbi Berg's words. But in general, light predates the sun. Light, it was first conjured by God. He created the sun, and, he brought order to chaos. That's what the symbolism behind light is. Light brings order to the chaos of the dark, just like God. And that is, I think, how Rabbi Berg summed it up, and I think that's a very fascinating way. I never thought of it in this nature. But then to go back to, one of the first things I talked about, the afterlife. Christians often associate flame and brimstone, what have you, with hell. But hell is not as extreme in Judaism. Heaven is more like the light of souls joining the light of God. So here we have the light of God, already magnificent and great, being heightened by the joining of more bright souls. There's not as much of a focus on the afterlife, because everybody will eventually get there in Judaism. And there's no dogmatic view. There are many different views within the Jewish faith of what the afterlife is like. So there's no real that competitive edge, as I think that we see in Christianity. And some might say that's a good thing, some might say that's a bad thing. It only depends on your opinion. And there's no notion of original sin either, which is extremely fascinating. So there's no anxiety about death. Jews are taught just to live in God's way. And there's no feeling of trying to repent for Adam and Eve's sins. And, to tie things up, conversion. Light is used to brighten the minds, to enlighten the minds, to bring light to darkness. And many religions see that as conversion, but the Jews don't believe in strictly converting people to become like them. Rabbi Berg tells us that it's about spreading truths and values that all humans can relate to. It's to preach basic human decency and civility, which I think is a very noble thing to do. Granted, as with all religions, it has gone astray at times, and I think that can, generate a very negative image. But I think the thought here is really refreshing. And now on to the next field work. A good friend of mine, who I am lucky enough to have played soccer with, who carpool with, to interact with on almost a daily basis until he went to college, was a Baha'i. And before I knew Nabil, I had never been, very familiar with the Baha'i faith. So Molly and I decided that we would kind of use Nabil while he was in town to, kind of glean more from the fireside ceremony. And a fireside ceremony is when, local Baha'i practitioners come together, eat, talk, discuss the local happenings of the day, and kind of just talk about their faith and how they're struggling, how they're relishing all the opportunities that they're having, how they're, doing well. So it was a very interesting experience, and I learned a lot from it. So the Baha'i faith is very interesting. In the middle of this guy's room, his living room, there's a table, and it's called the progression table of religion. It starts out with the Hindu faith, with Krishna as like the revelation.